Before a single god walked the lands between, before any throne was built or any divine order was declared, there was a man from a land most people have never heard of. And that man would go on to shape an entire world. His name was Hoarah. He was the chieftain of the Badlands, a harsh and distant region far beyond the lands between, past the Sea of Fog. We do not know how old he was. We do not know who raised him or where exactly he came from before he rose to lead his people. The lore gives us nothing on that. What we know is that by the time Hoarah enters the story, he is already at the top. He is already the man that other warriors look up to, follow, and fear. The Badlands were not a place built for comfort. They were built for one thing, and one thing only: strength. The culture that Hoarah led measured a person's worth entirely by their ability to fight and win. There was no room for ceremony, no room for decoration, no room for anything that did not serve the purpose of being a warrior. The people there rejected excess. They shunned ornamentation. They stripped away anything that was not necessary and fought with nothing but their bodies, their weapons, and their will. The champion headband, an item in Elden Ring, says it all plainly. It was reserved for the bravest warriors of the Badlands, proof that whoever wore it had faced countless enemies and come out the other side standing. And it was worn in the tradition of Hoarah himself, who led by example in that rejection of excess. His warriors dressed like him, fought like him, and carried themselves like him. That was the culture he built. The weapon of choice in the Badlands was the axe, not a sword, not a spear, an axe. For Hoarah this was personal. He wielded it himself, and his people followed that tradition after him. The axe of Godfrey and the axe talisman both confirm this, pointing back to a warrior tradition that started with him and outlasted him by generations. The axe was more than a weapon in the Badlands. It was a symbol of who they were and who their leader was. And Hoarah did not lead through inheritance or divine favor. He did not sit on any throne handed to him by a higher power. He led because he was the most dangerous person in a land full of dangerous people. He survived every fight. He won when others fell. He earned his authority the only way his culture respected, through sheer physical dominance and the kind of presence that tells everyone around you that you are not the one to challenge. That is who Hoarah was before anyone outside the Badlands ever heard his name. Now, across the Sea of Fog, something much larger was happening. Queen Marika, the Eternal, was in the process of building something that had never existed before. She was forming the Golden Order, a divine framework of power centered around the Erdtree, a massive golden tree whose light and grace governed everything Marika intended to rule. And she was winning. She was consolidating power over the lands between, pulling more and more territory under her control, and bringing gods, creatures, and entire civilizations to heel. But there were wars that even Marika's divine authority could not declare and win through decree alone. She needed a warrior. She needed someone who could take her divine mission and carry it across the battlefield with overwhelming force. Someone who could lead armies into conflicts that no one else could win. Someone who, frankly, was built for nothing else. Hoarah was that person. We do not know how their first meeting happened. The game does not tell us. There is no scene, no description, no record of the moment when the goddess of the lands between first looked at the chieftain from across the fog and decided he was the one. But the outcome is confirmed. Marika chose Hoarah as her first Elden Lord consort. She brought the raw, undecorated power of the Badlands together with the divine authority of the Erdtree. And in doing so, she created something entirely new. The man from the Badlands was given a new name. He became Godfrey, first Elden Lord. And through their union, something else was created too. A bloodline. the first demigod bloodline. Godric's Great Rune tells us directly that the first demigods came from the Elden Lord Godfrey and his children, the Golden Lineage. Before the Shattering, before the Night of the Black Knives, before any of the catastrophes that would later tear the lands between apart, there was this moment. A warrior from beyond the fog and a goddess at the height of her power, creating a new kind of life together. That golden lineage would go on to produce some of the most powerful and most tragic figures in Elden Ring's entire world. But none of that comes yet. What comes next is war. Because Marika did not choose Hoarah Loux to sit beside her at a banquet table. She chose him to go out and fight every enemy that stood between her and total control of the lands between. Giants, stormlords, dragons, ancient things that predated the Erdtree itself. All of it was waiting. And Godfrey, first Elden Lord, was about to get to work. Becoming a lord was not a title that Marika handed over. For Hoarah Loux, it required a transformation, and that transformation came with a cost that he would carry on his back for the rest of his life. Before Hoarah Loux could stand beside a goddess and rule a kingdom, there was a problem. He was, at his core, a creature of war. Not in a poetic sense. Literally. The lore describes it as a ceaseless lust for battle that raged inside him. A constant, unrelenting drive toward combat that never quieted, never rested, and never stopped pushing him toward the next fight. That was the engine that made him the most feared warrior in the Badlands. That was the thing that made him so valuable on a battlefield. But a lord cannot be only that. A lord has to govern. He has to stand still. He has to attend to the business of ruling a kingdom, managing armies, receiving counsel, and operating within the structure of a divine order. A man who cannot stop himself from wanting to fight everything in front of him is not suited for that life, not without help. So when Hoarah Loux made his vow to become a lord, he did something that changed everything about how he existed in the world. He took Serosh, the great beast regent, upon his back. The Godfrey icon talisman describes this moment directly. Godfrey was a ferocious warrior, it says. And when he vowed to become a lord, he took the beast regent Serosh upon his back to suppress that ceaseless battle lust burning inside him. This was not a partnership in the traditional sense. This was Hoarah Loux willingly accepting a living restraint. A constant, breathing check on his own nature, mounted on his shoulders, present in every room he entered and every battle he stood in. Serosh was not a small creature. He was a great lion. His coat was dark grey, his mane silvery white, and his eyes were milky and scarred, the kind of eyes that belong to something ancient and weathered by time. In his younger years, that mane had been golden. The Beast Claw Greathammer connects him to the Lord of Beasts title directly, and the item acknowledges his eventual role as Godfrey's regent. He was not some wild animal tamed as a trophy. He was a figure of authority in his own right, described in the Golden Beast crest shield as an aged counselor who guided the golden lineage. He wore silver plate mail. This was a being of standing, of wisdom, of deliberate purpose. And his purpose, from the moment he took his place on Godfrey's back, was to hold the warrior back from himself. During the Godfrey boss fight later in the game, you can see exactly what that relationship looked like in practice. Serosh appears on Godfrey's back in a translucent, partially immaterial form, his teeth sunk into Godfrey's left shoulder. Not resting there, not sitting there decoratively, actively biting him, actively pulling against whatever impulse Hoarah Loux was feeling in that moment. Every swing of the axe in that fight, every massive stomp and measured strike, is Hoarah Loux's raw instinct being filtered through Serosh's suppression. You are not watching a free man fight. You are watching a man restrained, and the fight still looks like that. Think about what that means for the decades before the game. Every meeting with generals and commanders, every ceremony in Leyndell, every moment spent standing in council chambers or walking the halls of a divine kingdom. Sarosh was there, doing the same thing, holding the line between the lord that Hoarah promised to be and the warrior that he actually was at his core. That was the price of the vow, not a one-time sacrifice, a continuous, daily cost that lasted as long as Godfrey existed. Sarosh's importance to the Golden lineage did not stop at Godfrey personally. His lion insignia became the symbol of the entire dynasty. Soldier surcoats carried it, shields displayed it, armor bore it. He became, in the visual language of the Golden Order, the emblem of Godfrey's rule and everything that rule represented. The Radahn's lion armor description captures this clearly, stating that the golden lion symbolized Godfrey the Elden Lord and his beast regent Sarosh together as a unified image, and that Radahn himself, from his youngest years, was captivated by the figure of the Lord of the battlefield. This was not just one man and his companion. This was an icon, a symbol that generations of warriors looked up to long after both of them were gone. That kind of legacy does not come from a decorative relationship. It comes from a real one. Sarosh and Godfrey were bound to each other in a way that went far deeper than anything symbolic. The bond held through every campaign Godfrey fought. It held through his exile from the lands between. It held through the long march across the world beyond the fog. It held through his own passing and his eventual return from beyond the grave when Grace called the Tarnished back home. Through all of it, Sarosh remained, still on his back, still holding, still doing the job he had agreed to do from the moment Hoarah made his vow. That bond would only end once, at a moment Godfrey chose himself, in the final confrontation at the Elden throne. But we are not there yet. What matters right now is understanding what Godfrey was when he stepped onto those battlefields as the first Elden Lord. He was a man carrying the most dangerous version of himself on his own shoulders, kept in check by an ancient lion whose job was to make sure the Lord showed up instead of the beast. And somehow, with all of that, he still became the most feared commander the lands between had ever seen. That is who walked into the war against the giants. That is who faced the Storm Lord alone, a warrior so powerful that becoming a ruler required a living spiritual anchor just to make it possible. And the wars he was about to fight would prove exactly why Marika needed someone like that in the first place. When the Golden Order was young, it was not golden at all. It was a battlefield. Everything that existed in the lands between, before Marika's rise, had its own power, its own history, and its own reason to resist what she was building. The Erdtree was not handed dominion over the world. It had to take it. And the man tasked with taking it was Godfrey. The Elden Lord armor set, all 4 pieces carrying the same description, lays out his military career in plain terms. The age of the Erdtree began among conflict. Godfrey was lord of the battlefield. He led the war against the giants. He faced the Storm Lord alone. And then, when the last worthy enemy fell, something happened to him that no one could have predicted. But we will get to that. First, the wars. Godfrey did not ride out alone. He commanded an elite war band unlike anything that had existed before, a force called the Crucible Knights. These were not ordinary soldiers. The Crucible Axe Helm tells us they served Godfrey directly as the first Elden Lord, and their power came from the Crucible itself, the primordial form of the Erdtree, the ancient state of life before the tree gave it shape and order. In the beginning of the world, all life was blended together in this raw, formless state. The Crucible Knights carried that energy in their bodies and their armor. They were living extensions of something older than the Golden Order itself, 2 captains led them. Ordovis commanded the Axe Knights, and his mark, the axe ornamentation, was worn by every soldier under him. Siluria commanded the Tree Knights. Together, these 2 wings of Godfrey's personal warband formed the fighting force that marched at the front of every major campaign of the early Golden Order. Here is the part that makes their story worth pausing on. The Crucible Knights were the builders of the world that Elden Ring takes place in. They fought the wars that made the Erdtree's dominance possible. They bled for a kingdom that would go on to become one of the most powerful institutions in the lands between. And in return for that, the Golden Order eventually looked back at them and decided they were a problem. The Crucible Axe gauntlets record it directly. In time, the strength these knights showed, and even the way they looked, was seen as chaotic and deserving of scorn. The very people who built the Order became outcasts inside it. That contradiction sits at the heart of everything the Golden Order would eventually become. But in Godfrey's era, they were his. They were the best fighters the world had, and they followed him everywhere. The scale of what Godfrey accomplished during this period is hard to overstate without listing conflict after conflict. So consider this single line preserved in the lore. In the beginning, everything was in opposition to the Erdtree. Everything. And through countless victories in war, it became the embodiment of order. Godfrey was the instrument of those countless victories. Every enemy that fell, every power that was brought to heel, every territory that came under the golden light of the Erdtree. That was Godfrey's work. Marika herself acknowledged it. Her words survive in what the game calls spoken echoes, fragments of her voice preserved at specific locations across the lands between. The one at the first church of Marika, relayed by Melina during the game's events, speaks directly to Godfrey and his warriors after the giant campaign. She commends their deeds. She tells them that guidance has carried them through the worst of it to where they now stand. She gives the final order to put the giants down and confine their flame atop the mountain. And then she looks forward to what all of it was building toward. A new epoch, she calls it. One glistening with life. The age of the Erdtree. Those words are a reward and a command at the same time. A recognition that what Godfrey and his army had done was the foundation of everything she was creating. Without the battles he won, the age of the Erdtree does not begin. Without the Crucible Knights carving through enemies that predated the Golden Order, the Erdtree does not become what it becomes. Godfrey was not a symbol of the Golden Order's power. He was the reason it had power at all. And through all of it, Sarosh remained on his back. Every campaign, every battlefield, every moment of command and every meeting with generals and lords, the restraint held. The Lord showed up when the warrior wanted to come out. The vow was kept. But a vow built around conquest runs into a specific kind of problem eventually. You can only conquer so much. You can only defeat so many enemies before you run out of them. And what happens to a man like Hoarah, a man whose entire identity was built around the need for a worthy fight, when there are no more worthy fights left? The Elden Lord armor answers that question quietly. When the last worthy enemy fell, the hue of Godfrey's eyes faded. The wars were over, and that was the beginning of the end of everything he had built. Of all the campaigns Godfrey fought under the banner of the Golden Order, one stood above the rest, not just in scale, but in what it meant for everything that came after. The war against the giants was the conflict that decided whether the age of the Erdtree was actually going to happen. The giants, also called fire giants, were not a powerful enemy faction. They were the custodians of something genuinely dangerous to the Erdtree. They guarded the flame of ruin, a primordial fire that carried within it the power to destroy the Erdtree itself. Not weaken it, not threaten it, end it. A flame that, if unleashed, could undo everything Marika had built and everything she intended to build. As long as the giants stood and the flame of ruin was in their keeping, the Golden Order had a ceiling on how secure it could ever truly be. Marika's answer to that problem was Godfrey. Her order was direct: put the giants down and confine the flame atop the mountain. Godfrey led his golden armies into the mountaintops of the giants, the high, frozen territory where the giant civilization lived. The somber smithing stone found in that region carries a detail that anchors how significant this campaign was considered even at the time. It is described as having been used to sharpen the weapons of the champions who fought in that war at the very birth of the Erdtree. The people who crafted those stones understood that the weapons being prepared were not for an ordinary conflict. They were for the foundational war of a new age. The campaign was a complete military success. The fire giant civilization was broken. Their culture, their numbers, their ability to threaten the Erdtree, all of it was crushed. Godfrey's armies moved through the mountaintops and left ruin behind them in the most literal sense possible. If you travel to that region in the game, the evidence is still there. The bones of giants scattered across the frozen landscape. The wreckage of a civilization that once stretched across those peaks. Thousands of years have passed in the world of Elden Ring between that war and the events of the game, and the destruction is still visible everywhere you walk. Only one fire giant survived. He stands at the Forge of the Giants, the last of his kind, still there, still watching, unable to fully pass from the world. An eternal reminder that something enormous was ended in that place. But here is the detail that matters most, and it is one that the lore is very specific about. Marika did not order the flame of ruin destroyed. She ordered it confined, controlled, kept atop the mountain but not extinguished. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and the game does not let you forget it. That flame, contained, is exactly what Melina uses during the base game's events to ignite the Erdtree. The means to do that existed because Marika chose preservation over destruction all those ages ago. Why she made that choice is a question the lore leaves open. The practical reading is that total destruction of such a primordial fire may not have been possible, and containment was the achievable goal. But some lore analysts have raised a different possibility. If the flame of ruin is the one force capable of destroying the Erdtree, then choosing to preserve it. Marika wanted that option to remain available, not necessarily to use immediately, but to keep. A contingency, a means of rebellion against the greater will, the divine force whose authority the Erdtree represented, if she ever decided to turn against it. The research document is clear that this is a fan theory, not confirmed lore. But the choice itself is confirmed, and the fact that it had enormous consequences later is not up for debate. What is also not up for debate is what this victory meant for Godfrey's standing and for the Golden Order as a whole. The war against the giants removed the single greatest existential threat to the Erdtree's dominance. Before this campaign, the Golden Order had a wound it could not close. After it, the age of the Erdtree could begin in earnest. Marika could declare her epoch, glistening with life, because her champion had gone up into those frozen mountains and made it possible. Every site of grace in the lands between, every golden light that guides the Tarnished through the game, every aspect of the world built under the Erdtree's canopy traces back in some way to what was won on those mountaintops. Godfrey made all of it possible with iron, axes, and an army that carried the Crucible's ancient power in their armor. He came down from the mountain with the giants broken and the flame locked away, and the Golden Order had never been stronger. But there was still one more enemy standing. One Godfrey would face not with an army, not with the Crucible Knights at his side, but entirely alone. Every war Godfrey fought up to this point had been a campaign, an organized military effort with armies, captains, and the full weight of the Golden Order behind him. The war against the giants was won with numbers, with strategy, with the Crucible Knights cutting through an entire civilization. That is how most of history gets made, through organized force, coordinated and directed at a target. But the Elden Lord armor set, the same source that chronicles his entire military career, includes one line about a different kind of confrontation. After the giant campaign, Godfrey faced the Storm Lord, alone. No army, no warband, no Crucible Knights flanking him on either side. One champion against another, with nothing between them but open ground and whatever each of them was capable of. We do not have a detailed account of how that fight unfolded. The lore does not give us a play-by-play. What it gives us is the outcome and what the outcome produced. Godfrey won, and his victory over the Stormlord gave him rightful claim to Stormvale Castle, the enormous fortress that sits at the gateway to Limgrave. The castle's name, its history, its entire identity as a structure is rooted in that single combat. Stormvale exists as it does because Godfrey stood in front of the Stormlord and walked away. If you play Elden Ring, Stormvale Castle is one of the first major landmarks you encounter. It dominates the entrance to the region, built on a cliff overlooking the surrounding land, unmistakably powerful and unmistakably old. Most players who reach it are focused on getting through it, but the fortress itself is a monument to that personal jewel. Every stone of it is a record of what Godfrey was capable of when he fought without anyone watching his back. That is the thing about the Stormlord fight that stands apart from everything else in his military career. The giants were a civilization, and Godfrey dismantled them with an army. The Stormlord was a single enemy, and Godfrey handled that personally. It shows you the full range of what he was. He could command armies across frozen mountaintops, and he could also step forward alone and end something that apparently required the first Elden Lord himself to finish. Beyond the giants and the Stormlord, the scope of Godfrey's campaigns extended across the entire pre-Erdtree world. The lore is clear that everything was in opposition to the Erdtree at the start. Dragons, ancient beastmen, beings connected to the Crucible, that primordial state of life that predated the Erdtree's ordered existence. All of it had to be dealt with before the Golden Order could claim genuine dominance over the lands between. Some of those conflicts involved Godfrey directly. Others were fought by his armies, operating under his command. The Crucible Knights themselves are evidence of this, given that their power came directly from the Crucible energy they carried in their bodies and armor. The fact that Godfrey's personal warband drew on that same primordial force suggests strongly that he was operating against Crucible-affiliated enemies, using the power of what he was conquering to do the conquering. That is a detail the lore implies through the identity of his soldiers. Some of the most careful analysts of Elden Ring's story, including Vati Vidya, have pointed to the beastmen of Farum Azula as likely targets of Godfrey's campaigns. The beastmen embody that same ancient Crucible energy, and their subjugation would fit the pattern of Marika's broader agenda, which was to suppress the old formless world of blended life in favor of the Erdtree's structured Golden Order. This reading is a fan theory, but the Crucible Knight's identity makes the connection feel grounded. Step back and look at all of this together. The giants, broken. The Stormlord, defeated in single combat. Dragons, subjugated. Beastmen and Crucible-bearing enemies, brought to heel. The Crucible Knights, Godfrey's personal warband, operating across every major theatre of conflict. Every significant power that existed in the lands between before the Erdtree's dominance either fell to Godfrey or submitted to the order he was enforcing. The world that players walk through in Elden Ring, the political geography of every region, every great castle, every ancient ruin, every faction that exists in some form of submission or rebellion against the legacy of the Golden Order was shaped by Godfrey's campaigns. He was not just a fighter. He was the person who decided, through force, what the world was going to look like. The architect of it all, working with an axe instead of a blueprint. And when the last worthy enemy fell, the world he had built was finally at peace. That peace would cost him everything. Godfrey and Marika had 3 children together. And if you want to understand what the Golden Order actually was, beneath all its divine authority and golden light, look at what happened to those 3 children. Look at what the system that Godfrey built did to his own family. The first was Godwyn the Golden, the eldest. Golden-haired, celebrated, and by every account, the living embodiment of what the Golden Order wanted to represent. If you designed a perfect heir for the first Elden Lord and the Eternal Queen, Godwyn was the answer. He was a warrior, genuinely powerful and proven in battle. But he was also something his father never fully got to be. He was noble. He was capable of mercy. He understood that not every defeated enemy needed to be finished. The moment that defined him was the ancient dragon war. When the great dragon Grandsax breached the walls of Leyndell itself, Godwyn went out to meet the dragon Fortisax in personal combat outside the capital. He won. And then, with Fortisax at his mercy, Godwyn did not finish the fight the way a lesser warrior might have. He extended his hand instead. He forged a friendship with his fallen enemy. That single act of grace ended the war entirely and gave rise to the ancient dragon cult within the capital. The lightning spear incantation records it plainly, stating that Godwyn defeated Fortisax and then befriended him, and that this was the event that founded the cult. Think about what Godfrey must have felt seeing that. A man who had suppressed his own battle lust for decades, who had carried a living restraint on his back just to be able to function as a lord, watching his son walk off a battlefield and turn a defeated dragon into an ally through sheer decency. Godwyn was not just Godfrey's child. He was proof that the sacrifice of the vow had produced something worth protecting. Then there were the twins. Morgott and Mog were born as omens. Under the Golden Order, this was not a neutral fact. Omens were considered bearers of a cursed, impure blood. They were born with horns and features tied to the primordial crucible, that ancient blended state of life that predated the Erdtree's ordered existence. The same force that Godfrey had spent his career subjugating, the same energy his crucible knights had carried as a weapon. And 2 of his sons were born carrying it in their bodies. For common omen, the procedure at birth was to have those horns excised. It was violent, it was frequently fatal, and it was the Golden Order's answer to something it had decided was impure. Royal omen were treated differently. The regal omen bairn item tells us directly that omen babies born of royalty were not subjected to excision. Instead, they were kept underground, hidden from everyone, imprisoned for the rest of their lives. So that is what happened to Morgott and Mog, the sons of the first Elden Lord and the Eternal Queen, hidden beneath Leyndell in the subterranean shunning grounds, locked away so that the Golden Order would never have to answer the question of how the goddess and her champion had produced children the Order itself considered cursed. Their existence was a contradiction the system could not absorb, so the system buried them, and then it left them to decide what to do with that. Morgott made his choice. He renounced his omen nature entirely. He sealed away the accursed aspects of his own blood and dedicated himself completely to protecting the Erdtree, the same institution that had imprisoned him as a child and hidden him from the world. His remembrance captures what that life actually looked like. He took it upon himself to become the Erdtree's protector, it says. He loved it without receiving love in return, for he had never been loved, and he loved it anyway. That is not the story of someone who found peace with his situation. That is the story of someone who chose devotion to the very thing that rejected him, and kept choosing it until the end. Morgott died defending the Erdtree from the Tarnished. He gave everything to a system that gave him a cage. Mog went the other direction entirely. Underground, far from the golden light of anything connected to the Erdtree, he made contact with something else. The formless mother, an outer god, found him in the dark and ignited his accursed blood with her power. Mog did not reject what he was. He embraced it completely and built something of his own from the bottom up, eventually establishing his own dynasty in Mogwyn Palace. His great rune reflects the contrast with his brother directly. The two runes are naturally similar, it says, because the twins share a bloodline. But Mog's is soaked in accursed energy, drawn from his deep devotion to the wretched place he was born into, far below the earth. Two brothers, same birth, same prison, same starting point. One spent his life trying to earn acceptance from something that would never accept him. The other decided to stop asking. There is a specific kind of ending that does not look like an ending from the outside. No battle lost, no great failure, no moment of weakness or betrayal or collapse. Just a man standing in a world that no longer has anything left for him to conquer, and the divine light in his eyes quietly going out. That is what happened to Godfrey. Grace in Elden Ring is not a metaphor. It is a tangible, visible thing. It lives in the eyes as a golden light. It guides the blessed through the world via sights of grace, those warm golden pools of rest that dot the lands between and point the favored toward their purpose. Grace is the Erdtree's blessing made physical, a sign that the greater will has a use for you, that your presence in the world is sanctioned and directed by something larger than yourself. To have it is to be chosen. To lose it is to become tarnished, faded, grace stripped, still alive but no longer guided, no longer lit from within, no longer moving through the world with divine purpose behind every step. Godfrey lost his grace. And here is the thing that makes his story unlike almost anyone else's in Elden Ring. He did not lose it because he failed. He did not lose it because he sinned or turned against the Order or made some terrible choice that cost him divine favor. He lost it because he succeeded, completely, totally. The last worthy enemy fell, and with no more enemies left to face, no more campaigns left to run, no more corners of the lands between left to bring under the Erdtree's dominion, the grace had nothing left to point him toward. His purpose, as defined by the greater will's relationship with the Golden Order, was finished, and so the grace finished with it. The Elden Lord armor records the moment without drama. There came a moment when his last worthy enemy fell, and it was then that the hue of Lord Godfrey's eyes faded. That is all it says. No catastrophe, no confrontation. Just a moment, and then the gold was gone. What followed was Marika formalizing what had already quietly happened. Her spoken echo at the third church of Marika, preserved across the ages and relayed by Melina during the game's events, contains her words to Godfrey and his warriors at the point of their exile. She divests each of them of their grace, she tells them. With their eyes dimmed, they will be driven from the lands between. They will go to a land far away, where they will wage war and live and eventually pass from the world. Read those words plainly, and they sound like a punishment, a dismissal, a goddess sending away the husband and army that were no longer useful to her. And on a surface level, that is exactly what it was. But Marika left more words behind, and they changed the picture significantly. A second spoken echo, preserved at the Queen's bedchamber, contains the rest of what she told them. After their passing, she says, she will give back what she once claimed. They are to return to the lands between, wage war, and take hold of the Elden Ring. They are to grow strong in the face of passing from the world. These are her words to the warriors of her lord, Lord Godfrey. That second message is not a punishment, it is a design. Marika was not casting out a man who had outlived his usefulness. She was building something. The exile was not an ending. It was a forge. Godfrey and his warriors would go out beyond the fog, fight wars in a distant land, pass from the world repeatedly, return through whatever stubbornness or residual connection to grace they carried, and grow stronger with every cycle. They would become a class of warriors, hardened by the experience of passing from the world and coming back over and over until the day grace called them home. The Tarnished class was not an accident of history. It was engineered, and Godfrey's exile was the moment that engineering began. Whether Marika planned this from the very beginning of their relationship is a question the lore raises but does not definitively answer. Some of the most careful analysts of Elden Ring's story, including Vatividya, have argued that the exile was premeditated from the start, that Marika always intended to use Godfrey as the foundation for creating the Tarnished, and that the Golden Eyes and the wars and the lordship were always going to lead here. The language of the second spoken echo, particularly the phrase about giving back what she once claimed after their passing, does suggest a plan that was already in place. But the text cannot confirm exactly when Marika made that decision, and the debate remains open. A second thread of analysis points in a related direction. Some community readers have argued that Marika's decision to exile Godfrey was not only about creating the Tarnished, but also about clearing the path for something she intended to do against the greater will itself. Godfrey was the most powerful, most loyal instrument the Golden Order had, a man who had spent his entire career enforcing Marika's divine mandate through force. If she was already considering acting against the greater will, if the shattering of the Elden Ring was already somewhere in her thinking, then Godfrey would have been the single greatest obstacle to that. Too devoted, too powerful, too committed to the order she was planning to break. Under that reading, the exile served two purposes at once. It created the Tarnished, and it removed the one person who might have stopped what she was about to do. This is fan theory, but it fits the shape of everything that followed. What is confirmed is this: Godfrey was stripped of grace, driven from the lands between, and sent out beyond the fog with his warriors at his back. The man who had won every war the Golden Order needed won, who had shaped the entire political geography of the lands between through decades of campaigning, who had carried Sarosh on his shoulders as a living restraint just to be able to function as a lord, was handed his exile like a final set of orders. And he followed them, because that is what he had always done. He gathered his warriors, he crossed the sea of fog, and he began the long march. Godfrey did not walk into exile alone. Every warrior who had followed him through the giant campaign, through the Storm Lord duel, through every conflict that built the Golden Order from nothing into the dominant power of the lands between, followed him out of it. When Marika stripped Godfrey of his grace, that same dimming passed through his entire army. The golden light left their eyes too, and when their lord crossed the sea of fog, they crossed with him. The rusty anchor, a weapon found in the game, carries a single detail about that departure that lands quietly and does not let go. While the Tarnished left the lands between with their lord, it says, one boat alone was said to have been left behind, one empty vessel sitting at the shore, while an entire warrior class sailed away into exile. That image says more about the scale of the departure than any headcount could. They all went, every one of them. The men and women who had spent their lives fighting for the Golden Order walked away from it together, following the only leader they had ever truly served. These were the first Tarnished, the original version of something that would eventually become an entire class of people spread across the world beyond the fog. The word itself matters. In Japanese, the Tarnished are called asebito, which translates directly as faded person, not defeated, not cursed, not fallen, faded. The golden light that once lived in their eyes had dimmed and gone out, and what remained was still a person, still capable, still alive and dangerous, but no longer carrying divine blessing in any visible form. Stripped of grace, but not of the ability to function. That is the essential condition of every Tarnished in Elden Ring, and it started here, with Godfrey's army stepping onto those boats. Being Tarnished came with two defining qualities. The first was the loss of grace, that disconnection from the Erdtree's blessing and the guiding purpose it provided. The second was something that sounds like a gift, but functions more like a burden, depending on how you look at it. Resistance to true passing from the world. The Tarnished do not stay gone when they fall. They return. Not through divine intervention in any direct sense, but through something stubborn and residual in their nature that keeps pulling them back. They fall in battle, and then they are back. They fall again, and they are back again. Each time a little harder, a little more capable, a little more shaped by the experience of having gone through it before. The player character in Elden Ring is the direct inheritor of all of this. When you fall in combat and return to a site of grace, when you face a boss 20 times and learn something new on every attempt, when you grow stronger specifically because of what the experience of failing has taught you, that is not just a game mechanic. It is the lore expressing itself through the way you play. Marika designed the Tarnished to function exactly that way. You are doing exactly what she intended when she sent Godfrey and his warriors out beyond the fog all those ages ago. With Godfrey gone, Marika did not remain without a consort for long. She took Radagon as her second Elden Lord, and the nature of that relationship is one of the strangest revelations in the entire game. Radagon was not a separate person brought in from outside. Radagon was Marika herself, a second self that she carried within her, now given form and standing as her consort. Their union produced a second dynasty entirely distinct from the golden lineage that Godfrey had fathered. The children of Marika and Radagon, her own other self, would go on to become some of the most significant figures in the events that tore the lands between apart. But that lineage belongs to a different story than Godfrey's. What Godfrey's exile produced, in the end, was the foundation of the game's entire premise. The Tarnished exist because he was sent away. The mechanic of falling and returning exists because Marika designed the exile to create exactly that kind of warrior. The player's journey through the lands between, every fight and every death and every gradual accumulation of strength, traces back to a single moment when a goddess stripped the gold from her champion's eyes and sent him across the fog with a promise attached. She would call them back when the time was right, when the lands between needed what only a grace-hardened Tarnished warrior could provide. But before that call could come, Godfrey had an entire life left to live, and he was about to leave the Lord behind entirely. Beyond the sea of fog, there was no golden order, no Erdtree, no divine framework telling anyone what the world was supposed to look like or who was supposed to be in charge of it. There was just land and whatever lived on it, and a warrior chieftain leading a graceless army through all of it with a broken axe in his hand. The period after the exile is called the Long March. The lore does not give us a detailed map of where it went, or a list of every conflict fought along the way. What it gives us is the shape of it. A prolonged campaign through the world outside the lands between, led by Godfrey, carried out by the Tarnished warriors who had followed him out of everything they had ever known. They were not settlers. They were not refugees rebuilding in some peaceful corner of the world. They were fighters, and they kept fighting. The axe talisman records the tradition that defined this entire period. The lord who led the Long March bore an axe, it says, and his loyal warriors honored him by wielding axes of their own. The weapon culture of the Badlands, the same tradition Hoarah Loux had embodied before he ever became Godfrey, carried forward into exile and became the defining image of the march itself. A lord with an axe, followed by warriors with axes, moving through an unknown world and making their way through it the only way any of them had ever known how. And somewhere during that march, in a battle the lore does not name, Godfrey's great axe broke. The axe of Godfrey records this plainly. The weapon was broken in battle while he led the Tarnished during the Long March. What it says next is the part that reveals everything about who he was during this period. The axe was symbolic of his vow to conduct himself as a lord. It became an emblem of the golden lineage, and it was carried with the understanding that in the days of the past, a crown was warranted with strength. He did not replace it. That is the detail that matters most here. A man with the resources and the following to acquire a new weapon at any point chose instead to carry the broken one, to bear the evidence of the fight that cracked it, right there in his hands, for the rest of the march. The broken axe was not a failure he was trying to hide. It was a statement, a reminder of the vow he had made when he became a lord, and a declaration that the vow still held even out here, far beyond the Erdtree's light, with no throne behind him and no divine grace in his eyes. A crown is warranted with strength. He had said it before, lived it before, and now he was living it again in the hardest possible version of it. Stripped of everything that came with the title of First Elden Lord, leading people through an unmapped world, carrying a weapon that no longer worked the way it once had, and still holding the line between the lord he had promised to be and the warrior he had always been underneath. Sarosh was still on his back through all of it. The restraint held, the vow held. Even in exile, even past the fog, even with nothing left of the Golden Order, but the people marching beside him, Godfrey conducted himself as a lord. And then the march ended. The remembrance of Hoarah Loux tells us what happened when it did. When the long march of the Tarnished came to its conclusion, Godfrey divested himself of kingship. That is the exact language the law uses. He did not lose the title. He did not have it taken from him again. He removed it himself, deliberately, completely. He shed the name Godfrey and everything it represented, and he became Hoarah Loux again, chieftain of the Badlands. Nothing more. He and Sarosh returned to the Badlands, and they lived there together as simple warriors until the world took them. He passed from the world outside grace, outside a throne room, outside any structure of divine authority or golden order. The greatest military commander the lands between had ever produced ended his days doing the only thing he had ever actually wanted to do, living as a warrior in the place he had always come from. The game's treatment of his remembrance is the quietest confirmation of everything that Ark means. Every other remembrance in Elden Ring is named after a title or a role. The remembrance of the Grafted, the remembrance of the Star Scourge, the remembrance of the Omen King. Each one honors the office, the position, the thing the person became. The remembrance dropped when you defeat this character is called the remembrance of Hoarah Loux, not the remembrance of the first Elden Lord, not the remembrance of Godfrey, the man's actual name, the one he was born with, the one he carried before any vow, before any beast regent, before any goddess or divine order decided he was useful. That naming choice is not an accident. It is the game telling you directly which of the two identities was the real one. Godfrey was a role, a title, a mask built for a specific purpose, worn faithfully for as long as that purpose required it. Loux was the person inside it. And when the purpose was done and the march was over, and there was nothing left to lord over, he put the mask down and did not pick it up again. He passed from the world as Loux, a warrior from the Badlands. No throne, no grace, no title. And then, a very long time later, something called him back. While Loux lived out his final years in the Badlands, a world away from everything he had built, the lands between was moving towards something that could not be stopped. The age of the Erdtree, the epoch that Godfrey's wars had made possible, was about to be broken from the inside. It started with a theft. Malekith the Black Blade was the keeper of the Rune of Death, the divine principle that governed how and when living things could truly pass from the world. Under the Golden Order, true passing from the world had been effectively sealed away from the demigods. Death existed, but the kind of permanent, complete ending that the Rune of Death represented was locked up and guarded, kept out of reach to protect the divine order Marika had spent so long building. Malekith held that lock, and someone took a piece of it. Ranni the Witch was a Carrion Empyrean, one of the candidates the Greater Will had marked as a possible future vessel for divine power. She had her own reasons for wanting to escape the path that destiny had laid out for her, reasons that stretched far beyond the scope of Godfrey's story. But the act she committed on that night reached directly into his. She stole a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith. Through a process the lore describes only as a fearsome rite, she used that fragment to forge a set of weapons capable of ending a god. The Black Knives, blades that carried within them the power of true and permanent ending, the same principle that had been locked away to keep the divine order stable. Ranni herself confirms all of this directly in the game. She takes full responsibility without hesitation. She names what she did, how she did it, and that she did it alone in terms of the decision to act. The Black Knife assassins who carried those weapons were Numen women, members of the same ancient race as Marika herself. On a night of wintry fog, they used those blades against Godwyn the Golden, Godfrey's firstborn son, the golden-haired heir who had ended a dragon war through mercy, the warrior who had turned a defeated enemy into a friend and given rise to an entire religious tradition through a single act of grace, the person who embodied everything the Golden Order claimed to stand for. They went for him first. Sorcerer Rogia, one of the characters in the game who has studied this event most carefully, lays out what it meant in plain terms. Someone stole a fragment of the Rune of Death, he says, and on a bitter night took the life of Godwyn the Golden. That was the first recorded passing of a demigod in all of history, and it became the catalyst for everything that followed. But the nature of what happened to Godwyn was not a straightforward ending, and that is what makes it so difficult to sit with. The Black Knives were used in a specific way that separated his soul from his body. His soul was extinguished. His body was not. Godwyn did not receive a true passing from the world. He received something worse. His person, the part of him that was actually Godwyn, the mercy and the grace and the golden air, was erased. But his body remained, alive in a wrong and corrupted way, trapped in a state that was not life and not ending. From that corrupted body, still connected to the Erdtree through its roots beneath Leyndell, something called Deathroot began to spread. A creeping contamination moving through the World Tree's foundations, seeping outward from the place where Godwyn's body lay and could not rest. The sun, whose life had been the Golden Order's greatest proof of its own virtue, became, in his ruined form, one of the greatest threats to the Erdtree's continued existence. Godfrey was already gone when all of this happened, already past the fog, already in the final years of the Long March, or perhaps already back in the Badlands living as Hoarah Loux. He never knew. He could not have known. And Godwyn, the son he had never truly had the chance to raise or stand beside in the way a father should, was gone before any reunion was possible. The world Godfrey had spent his entire life building, every war fought, every enemy broken, every campaign that pushed the Erdtree's dominance outward across the lands between, had produced this. A divine order so rigid that it imprisoned two of his sons underground for the crime of being born. A political structure so brittle that a single stolen fragment of a sealed principle could shatter the stability of an age. And a son whose extraordinary nobility, whose capacity for grace in the middle of a battlefield, was repaid with an ending that denied him even the dignity of a true one. Godwyn never saw his father again. He passed from the world in a place Godfrey had conquered, betrayed by members of his own mother's race, for reasons that would not surface fully for a very long time. Whatever peace Hoarah Loux found in the Badlands in his final years, the world he had left behind was already coming apart, and it was only going to get worse. After Godwyn's passing, the lands between held its breath. The Night of the Black Knives had done something that the Golden Order had been built specifically to prevent. A demigod had been taken from the world. The divine architecture that was supposed to make that impossible had cracked, and the person at the center of all of it, the goddess who had constructed every piece of that architecture, had finally reached her limit. Marika took her stone hammer to the Elden Ring, the most sacred object in the lands between, the source of grace, the seat of divine order, the thing that Godfrey had spent his entire career as first Elden Lord protecting and expanding the dominion of. She shattered it. Radagon, her other self, attempted to undo what she had done. He tried to repair it. He failed. And the greater will, the divine force whose authority the Erdtree represented, and whose relationship with the Golden Order had governed the lands between for an age, responded by imprisoning Marika inside the Erdtree itself. The shards of the broken Elden Ring, the great runes, scattered outward to Marika's offspring. Each demigod received a piece of what had once been whole, and the power those shards carried was not clean or stabilizing. It was intoxicating and destabilizing in equal measure. The demigods who claimed great runes found themselves driven toward obsession, toward conflict, toward the desperate certainty that if they could gather enough shards, they could declare themselves the new Elden Lord and put the broken world back together on their own terms. What followed was the Shattering, an all-out war between the demigod factions, each one convinced of their own claim, none of them powerful enough to end it cleanly. The opening narration of Elden Ring describes it with a bleakness that matches what it actually was. The great Elden Ring was shattered, it says. Marika was nowhere to be found. Godwyn was the first to fall on the Night of the Black Knives. The demigods claimed the shards. The power warped them. The war began. And no lord arose from any of it. No lord arose. That phrase is the essential one. The Shattering was not a war with a winner. It was a war that consumed itself, grinding down every faction that entered it without producing anyone capable of claiming the throne on the other side. The greater will, watching a conflict that seemed to have no resolution, withdrew its direct involvement from the lands between entirely. The golden guidance that had once pointed the blessed toward their purpose went quiet. The age of divine order that Godfrey had built through decades of campaigning stopped functioning. And that is when Marika's contingency activated. She had built something into Godfrey's exile all those ages ago. A promise. A mechanism. The Tarnished who had followed their lord out beyond the fog, who had spent generations passing from the world and returning, growing harder with every cycle, would be called back when the lands between needed what only they could provide. That time had come. Grace reached out beyond the sea of fog, not the full, golden, purposeful grace of a functioning divine order. Something older and quieter than that. A call carried across an enormous distance to warriors who had been waiting for it, in one form or another, for longer than most of them could remember. The opening narration names the ones who answer. Hoarah Loux, chieftain of the Badlands, Goldmask, Fear, the deathbed companion, the Dung-Eater, Sir Gideon of Near, the all-knowing, and one other, it says, whom Grace would again bless. Hoarah Loux is named first. He answers first. He had passed from the world in the Badlands as a simple warrior, without a throne, without a title, without anything left of the identity he had worn as first Elden Lord. He was gone. And then Grace found him, and he was not gone anymore. He rose. He reclaimed his broken axe, the same weapon that had shattered during the long march and been carried as a symbol ever since. He took Sarosh upon his back one final time. The vow, the beast, the Lord, all of it assembled again after an age of absence. And then he crossed the sea of fog. He was coming home, not as the obedient instrument he had been the first time, not as a man carrying someone else's divine agenda on top of the beast already riding his shoulders. He was coming back as himself, to take what he had been promised, to stand in front of the Elden Ring one more time and answer the question that the Shattering had left open. Who was strong enough to be Elden Lord? He intended to show them. Before you ever meet the real Godfrey, the lands between shows you how it remembers him. Deep beneath Leyndell, the royal capital, guarding the path toward the heart of the Erdtree, there is a figure, translucent, golden, enormous in the way that only something ancient and deeply embedded in a place can feel enormous. It is not alive in any conventional sense. It is not the man who crossed the sea of fog and answered Grace's call. It is something older than that, and in some ways more revealing. This is the golden shade of Godfrey, first Elden Lord, an impression left behind in the place where he once ruled. Not a ghost in the traditional sense, and not a simple illusion. Something more like a memory made physical, a residual form generated by the sheer weight of the power Godfrey carried during his time as Elden Lord. He was present in Leyndell for long enough, and with enough force behind him, that the place itself held on to an echo of him long after he was gone. The Fextra Life Wiki describes it as exactly that, a phantom constructed from memory and residual golden energy, still standing watch over the path to the Erdtree's core. What the golden shade carries tells you something important. Its axe is unbroken, twin-bladed, whole, the weapon of a lord at the height of his power, before the long march and the battle that cracked it. This is Godfrey as he was during the age of his campaigns, before exile stripped everything away, and the march through the world beyond the fog ground down everything the title had been built on. The golden shade is the world's version of him, the official portrait, the image that survived in collective memory while the actual man was out past the fog, living a completely different life. Sarosh is on his back, as he always was. The crown is present. The golden light of the Erdtree's favor hangs over the entire encounter in a way that the real Godfrey, returned from exile as a tarnished warrior without grace in his eyes, does not carry anymore. You are fighting what the lands between kept of him, the version that history preserved, not the man himself, and the game signals this directly through what you receive for the fight. When you defeat the golden shade, you are given a talisman pouch, a reward that expands your equipment and enhances your capability going forward. It is a meaningful reward, practically speaking, but it is not a remembrance. Every major boss in Elden Ring whose story truly matters drops a remembrance, a direct fragment of that character's power and identity that you can choose to absorb or exchange. The Golden Shade drops nothing of that kind, because this is not the destination. It is a gate. The real confrontation with the real man still lies ahead. What the Golden Shade fight accomplishes is something that pure lore text cannot fully do on its own. It gives you a physical encounter with Godfrey as a concept before you meet him as a person. You feel how large he was in his prime. You see the unbroken axe and the crown and Sarosh biting into his shoulder, and understand, through the experience of fighting it, what the Golden Order's most powerful instrument actually looked like at full strength. After everything the game has told you about the giant campaign, and the Storm Lord, and the Exile, and the Long March, you now have a felt sense of the weight behind all of it. And then it lets you win, because you are supposed to win. The Golden Shade is a gate, and gates exist to be passed through. Leyndell is ash when you find him, the royal capital that Godfrey helped build through decades of campaigning. The city that grew up around the Erdtree's base and became the seat of the Golden Order's power has been reduced to cinders. The Erdtree itself has burned. The grandeur that once defined this place is gone, replaced by grey ruin and the smell of something enormous that will never be rebuilt the same way. This is what the world looks like now. This is what Godfrey came home to. And in the middle of all of it, at the Elden throne, you find the first Elden Lord on his knees. He is not kneeling in prayer. He is not resting after a long journey. He is kneeling beside Morgott, his son, whose body is in the process of crumbling apart on the floor of the throne room. Morgott, who spent his entire existence locked underground, who sealed away his own accursed nature to serve the order that imprisoned him, who passed from the world defending a throne that had never once acknowledged him as the royal heir he actually was. Godfrey returned from beyond the grave, crossed the sea of fog, and the first thing he found when he reached the throne was his son already gone. He speaks to Morgott first, not to you, not to the enemy standing in front of him, to his son. He tells him it has been a long while, that he fought long and hard. The words are quiet and complete in a way that does not need to be expanded on. A father who was taken from his children before they could grow, returned too late to do anything but acknowledge what they became without him. Then he stands and he turns to you. He calls you a tarnished warrior. He acknowledges what you are, spurned by the grace of gold, which is the exact condition he himself carried for the entirety of the Long March. He does not dismiss it. He tells you the Elden Ring rests close at hand, that he has returned to be granted audience with it once more, and then he declares himself on his full name, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, not Hoarah Loux, not the chieftain of the Badlands. He is wearing the title again for this fight, the same way he wore it for every campaign in the age of the Erdtree's rise. The role is back on. The mask is in place. Phase 1 of the fight is what that means in practice. He moves with weight and deliberateness that communicates control above everything else. Massive stomps that crack the stone beneath him and send force rippling outward. Roars that generate visible shockwaves. Overhead axe slams that do not just hit you, but reshape the ground they land on. Everything in his Phase 1 moveset is large and measured and powerful in a way that feels considered. This is a lord fighting. A commander who has thought about combat for decades and reduced it to its most effective expressions. The voice actor, Edward Rowe, plays both Godfrey and Hoarah Loux, and the performance is notably different between the two phases. The voice you hear in Phase 1 is formal and weighted, carrying the cadence of someone who has spent a very long time speaking as a lord, choosing words deliberately presenting authority. It does not sound like a man from the Badlands. It sounds like the first Elden Lord, because that is who he is choosing to be right now. And even here, even in a fight to determine who will claim the Elden Ring, he is generous toward you. If you fall during Phase 1, he does not gloat or dismiss you. He tells you it was nobly fought, that your rest is deserved. A commander recognizing a worthy opponent. The same quality that defined his entire military career. The respect he gave to adversaries who earned it is still present in the way he responds to your defeat. The mask of lordship includes that. It always has. But the mask has a limit. It always had a limit. That is the entire reason Shattering exists. And you are about to find out what happens when Godfrey decides he has given it enough. There is a moment in this fight where everything you thought you understood about it stops being true. You have been reading him correctly up to this point. The measured strikes, the controlled weight behind every movement, the Lord's discipline holding the line between what he is and what he wants to be. You have been fighting Godfrey, and Godfrey has a shape you can learn. Heavy, deliberate, powerful in ways that give you time to respond if you are paying attention. The vow is holding. Shattering is holding. The mask is on. And then, at roughly half health, he reaches back over his shoulder. He grabs Shattering with his bare hands. The ancient lion who has ridden on his back through every campaign, every year of exile, every death and return, through the entirety of a life that spanned an age of the world, the aged counselor, the living restraint, the price of the vow paid in full for longer than most civilizations have existed. Godfrey takes him in his hands, and he ends him. What he says in that moment is the most defining thing he says in the entire game. He tells Shattering that will be all, that the lion did him good service, that he has given him courtesy enough. That is it. No grand speech, no dramatic proclamation about freedom or identity or what he is about to become. Just a quiet, complete acknowledgement of a debt fully paid and a service fully rendered. Courtesy enough, the restraint held as long as it needed to hold, and now the job is done. He covers himself in Sharash's remains. He puts down the axe, the broken symbol of the vow he carried through the long march and all the years beyond it. And then the voice changes. Edward Rowe's performance shifts so completely between the two phases that it sounds like a different person entirely. The formal, weighted cadence of the Lord is gone. What replaces it is something rawer and lower and older, a voice that has never had any use for ceremony or titles, or the measured language of command. This is not the voice of the first Elden Lord. This is the voice of the chieftain of the Badlands, the man underneath every layer the story put on top of him. He roars that he fights now as Hoarah Loux, warrior. Phase 2 does not resemble Phase 1 in any way. The axe is gone. The controlled, deliberate moveset is gone. What you are facing now is a man using only his body, the same body that made him the most feared warrior in a land built entirely around the idea that physical dominance was the only thing that mattered. Body slams that hit the ground with enough force to crack it open, choke grabs, power throws, strikes that come from someone who learned to fight before anyone handed him a weapon and never forgot a single thing that learning taught him. The moveset has been compared to professional wrestling, and that comparison is accurate in the most meaningful way possible. This is not a trained fighter performing techniques. This is a human being who is more dangerous than anything else in the room, expressing that with nothing but his hands and his weight and his will. There is no Shattering anymore. There is no filtered version of this. Every impulse that the vow suppressed for an entire lifetime is fully present in every movement of Phase 2. The the ceaseless lust for battle that the Godfrey icon described, the thing that required a living spiritual anchor just to make lordship possible, is completely unrestrained for the first time since Loux made his vow. And what it looks like, fully expressed, is the most dangerous thing in the game. If you fall during Phase 2, he tells you that a crown is warranted with strength. Those exact words appear in the Axe of Godfrey item description, connecting directly to the philosophy he carried through the Long March, and every year before and after it. This is his oldest creed. It has not changed. Not through the campaigns, not through the exile, not through the Long March or the divesting of kingship or the passing from the world and the return from it. In the days of the past, a crown was warranted with strength. He believed it when he was the chieftain of the Badlands. He believed it when he was the first Elden Lord, and he believes it now. When you defeat him, his final words carry that same creed forward to you directly. He calls you brave. He tells you your strength is worthy of a crown. In the original release of the game, those words were followed by laughter. Not bitter laughter, not the laughter of someone in pain or in denial. Genuine, full, warm laughter. The kind that belongs to a warrior who has just been beaten by someone worthy of beating him and finds that genuinely satisfying. That laughter was removed in later patches of the game, but in the version where it existed, it was the most human moment in the entire fight. He is not mourning his loss. He is not raging against it. He is laughing because this is exactly how it was always supposed to end for someone like him. A crown is warranted with strength, and strength has just been demonstrated in the most direct way possible. He understands that completely. The two phases of this fight are not a dramatic device. They are the entire arc of Godfrey's life compressed into a single encounter. Phase 1 is everything he was built to be. The vow, the Lord, the title, the measured power of a man who suppressed himself for decades to serve a purpose that was never entirely his own. Phase 2 is everything he actually was. The warrior from the Badlands, the chieftain who led through physical dominance and the respect that comes from surviving every fight. The man who existed before any crown and continued to exist underneath every crown he ever wore. By ending Sarosh, he does not become something new. He has not transformed or evolved or found some new identity in the final moments of his life. He has stopped pretending that Godfrey was the whole story. He has taken off the mask and let you see the face that was always underneath it. When you look at what happened to Godfrey's children, you are looking at the full cost of everything he built. Not the cost paid by enemies on battlefields, the cost paid by his own family in a system that his campaigns made possible, and his absence allowed to calcify into something that crushed the people closest to him. 3 children, 3 entirely different lives, 3 endings that none of them deserved. Godwyn went first, the golden heir, the one who ended a dragon war through mercy, the son who represented the absolute best version of what the Golden Order claimed to stand for. His ending was covered in an earlier section, but what the Knight of Black Knives left behind is worth sitting with fully here, because it did not end with his passing. It continued. The Golden Epitaph, a weapon made to mark his passing, carries an inscription that captures the full weight of what his existence had become after the Knight of Black Knives. It was made to remember the first demigod to fall, it says, and it holds within it a prayer from a young boy asking his brother, his Lord brother, to please find a true ending. That prayer, simple and heartbroken, from someone close enough to Godwyn to call him brother and Lord in the same breath, says everything about what was left after the Black Knives did their work. He was not gone. He was not at rest. He was trapped in something that could not be called life and could not be called an ending. And the people who loved him could only ask, quietly, for the world to give him what had been taken from him. Morgoth's ending has already appeared in this story, at the moment his father found his crumbling body. But the weapon he left behind adds a layer to what that life actually looked like on the inside. Morgoth's cursed sword was not a weapon he chose. It was the blood he had spent his entire existence suppressing, the accursed omen nature that he sealed away and refused to claim as his own, reforming itself into a blade after his passing. The thing he rejected most completely about himself became the thing that outlasted him. Morg's ending carries its own specific cruelty. He was found and brought down by the Tarnished in Mogwyn Palace, the underground dynasty he had built entirely through his own ambition and the power of his accursed blood, starting from nothing but a cage beneath the city. And then, after the Tarnished ended him, his remains were not left alone. In the events of the Shadow of the Erdtree, his body was used as a vessel for Miquella's consort ritual, hollowed out and refilled with Radan's soul to serve another god's design. He built a dynasty with his own hands, and his remains became another god's throne. Even after passing from the world, he was used. None of them got what they were reaching for. Godwyn wanted to live with dignity, to be the noble heir his golden hair and his mercy promised he could be. He was taken treacherously, in a way that denied him even a clean ending. Morgoth wanted to earn grace, to be accepted by the order he devoted himself to completely and without reservation. He was never accepted. He served until there was nothing left of him, and grace never came. Mog wanted to build something of his own, to turn the accursed inheritance the Order had condemned him for into the foundation of his own power. His body ended up as furniture for someone else's ambition. 3 children, 3 different answers to the same impossible situation, and not one of those answers led anywhere good. There is one more person connected to Godfrey's bloodline worth naming here. Nephili Loux carries his surname, his warrior philosophy, and the fighting tradition of his people. Kenneth Haight, an NPC who has thought carefully about who has the right to rule Limgrave, describes her as being of proper lineage for exactly that purpose. The timing of her birth, coming after Godfrey, reverted to Hoarah Loux and returned to the Badlands, places her almost certainly as a descendant of the chieftain. She is the Badlands tradition carried forward, the Hoarah Loux line. Her quest line ends with her becoming the ruler of Stormvale Castle. His descendant now sits at the seat of his oldest personal conquest, carrying his name and his way of fighting into a new age. And if you have completed her quest line before you reach the Elden throne, she can be summoned to fight alongside you against Godfrey himself. A daughter, or close enough to one, standing at the player's side to help bring down her own father or forefather in the fight that determines who inherits the world. Godfrey built the lands between through force and sacrifice, and the suppression of everything he naturally was. His children inherited the world he made, and every single one of them was broken by it in some form, shaped by a system that used them the same way it used him, without ever quite giving back what it took. Godfrey does not appear in the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion. His story, as a direct participant in events, ended at the Elden throne. But the DLC does something that changes how you read almost everything that happened to him. It pulls back a layer on the world he lived in and shows you what was underneath it the entire time. The Land of Shadow, the realm the DLC takes place in, contains elder lions. These are ancient beasts blessed with horns by the primordial crucible, the same formless state of blended life that predated the Erdtree's ordered existence. And the civilization that once inhabited this realm, the Hornsent, revered those lions as divine, more than revered them. The divine beast warriors, at the gate of divinity, wore lion heads and allowed these creatures to control their movements and actions directly. A warrior carrying a divine beast on their body, surrendering a degree of their own will to a higher animal force in exchange for something greater. That should sound familiar. The parallel between the Horn-Sense divine beast warriors and Godfrey carrying Sarosh is direct enough that it reframes where and how their bond was formed. The Gate of Divinity was the passage through which Marika herself once ascended to godhood. The DLC lore strongly suggests that Loux's pairing with Sarosh happened at or near that same gate, as a requirement for his transformation into an Elden Lord consort. The ritual of a warrior taking a great lion onto their body to access a higher state was not something Marika invented for Godfrey. It was something that already existed in the world she had come from and shaped herself against. She knew exactly what she was asking him to do when she brought him to that gate. The second revelation hits closer to home for Godfrey's sons. The Horn-Sense civilization revered horn-bearers as sacred. Horns, in their culture, were a mark of divine connection, something to be honored and celebrated. The Golden Order declared the exact opposite. Under the framework Marika built and Godfrey enforced, horns were accursed, impure, the mark of something the Order could not accommodate. Omen were persecuted for carrying features that the Horn-Sense had considered holy. What the DLC reveals is that this was not a theological position the Golden Order arrived at independently through some natural process of belief. It was the direct result of Marika's campaign to suppress Horn-Sense cultural identity. The Newman, Marika's own people, had a history with the Horn-Sense that drove her to dismantle everything they stood for, including the reverence they gave to horn-bearers. The persecution of omens in the lands between was not rooted in any inherent quality of their horns. It was rooted in Marika's personal vendetta against the civilization that had shaped and apparently harmed her people. Morgott and Mog were imprisoned underground because their mother decided at some point before they were born that the culture which considered their features sacred needed to be erased. They were not victims of a natural divine law. They were casualties of a war their mother had already won long before they came into the world. A war whose consequences reached forward and crushed them before they could ever stand up. Godfrey was not present to see any of that happen, but his absence does not separate him from the system that produced it. He built the Golden Order's military dominance. He ran the campaigns that made Marika's authority over the lands between total and uncontested. The order that imprisoned his sons was the order his wars made possible. The DLC also gives Godfrey's arc a mirror in the form of Messmer the Impaler, the primary figure of the Shadow of the Erdtree. Messmer was Marika's son, sent into the Land of Shadow to conduct a campaign against the Horn-Sense on her behalf. He carried it out completely, with a thoroughness that the DLC does not soften in its presentation. And when his purpose was served, Marika abandoned him there. He was left in the Land of Shadow, cut off from the world he had acted in her name to shape, while the order he had served moved forward without him. The shape of that arc is identical to Godfrey's. A military instrument, chosen for a specific purpose, used to carry out the work the divine order needed done, and then set aside when the work was finished. Messmer in the Land of Shadow, Godfrey across the Sea of Fog. Both of them discarded not because they failed, but because they succeeded, and success was the end of their usefulness. The DLC also draws a line between how Sarosh was anchored to Godfrey and how Miquella attached himself to promised consort Radahn in the expansion's central storyline. In both cases, a higher power bound itself to a consort figure, exerting control or influence over that person's nature as part of the arrangement. The structural parallel suggests that Godfrey's relationship with Sarosh was not unique to him personally. It was part of a pattern in how power worked in this world. Consorts were bound. The binding was the point. What all of this adds up to, taken together, is a portrait of Marika that the base game begins and the DLC completes. She was a person shaped by genuine trauma, someone whose history with the Hornsent persecution of her own people drove her toward a specific and sustained project of suppression. And she used everyone around her as instruments of that project. Godfrey was her sword. He cut what she needed cut. And when there was nothing left to cut, she sheathed him. Every major character in Elden Ring carries a story that is either incomplete or broken somewhere in the middle. Radahn, reduced to a hollow shell by the weight of the stars he refused to let fall. Ranni, working across an entire age to escape a fate she never consented to. Morgott, giving everything to something that gave him nothing back. These are stories with missing pieces, unresolved edges, questions the lore raises without fully closing. Godfrey is different. He is the only major figure in the entire game whose arc is complete on both ends. We know who he was before any of it started. A chieftain from the Badlands, no divine favor, no noble bloodline, nothing behind him but the respect earned through surviving every fight he ever walked into. We know what he became in the middle. The first Elden Lord, carrying a living restraint on his back, running campaigns that shaped the entire political geography of the lands between, building an age through force and discipline and a vow he kept for longer than most civilizations last. And we watch, in real time, the return to what he was at the beginning. The full circuit, closed. No other character in the game has that. It is what makes his story sit differently than the others when you reach the end of it. The reach of what he built extends across every corner of the game world, much of it in forms that have long forgotten their source. Radahn styled himself the Red Lion from his youngest years, captivated by the image of Godfrey and Sarosh as the unified symbol of the Lord of the battlefield. Stormvale Castle stands at the gateway to Limgrave as a monument to a personal duel fought against a single enemy with no army present. Nephili Loux carries his surname and his warrior philosophy into a new age, eventually sitting at the seat of that same conquest. The lion insignia appears on soldier surcoats, shields and armor across the lands between, outlasting the man who inspired it by an era. His sons never got the endings they reached for. His most beloved child never made it home. He returned from beyond the grave to find Morgott already gone. The quietest devastation in a game full of devastating things is that image at the Elden throne, the greatest lord the lands between ever produced, kneeling in the ash beside a crumbling body, speaking gently to a son he never got to know. And then he stood up and fought anyway, because that is who he was. When he finally falls at the Elden throne, his last words carry no bitterness, no anger at what was taken from him, no grief at what his life cost, no resentment toward the Tarnished standing over him. He is at peace, genuinely. Not because everything worked out, because it did not. Not because the world honored him the way he deserved, because it used him and set him aside. But because, at the very end, in the last fight of a life that spanned an age, he was exactly who he always was. Hoarah Loux, warrior from the Badlands, asking nothing more of the world than the chance to find out who was strongest.